Reading Third World Filmmaking and the West by Roy Armis, 1987. Chapter 6, Third Cinema. The anti-imperialist struggle of the peoples of the Third World and of their equivalents inside the imperialist countries constitutes today the axis of the world revolution. Third cinema is, in our opinion, the cinema that recognizes in that struggle the most gigantic cultural, scientific, and artistic manifestation of our time. The great possibility of constructing a liberated personality with each people as the starting point, in a word, the decolonization of culture. Fernando Solanas and Octavio Gattino. The post war years saw wide divergences in development in the Third World. The bulk of Africa was hardly touched by industrialization, and Egypt's economy, once a model of westernization, remained largely dormant, as did its level of film production. Only in the oil rich states was any new industrialization begun. But elsewhere, in Latin America and Asia, the situation was more dynamic, with new industrialization of three kinds. Firstly, in those countries with a potentially large domestic market, such as India, Mexico, and Brazil, there has been industrial expansion fostered by the state and an elite allied to Western interest, with output aimed partly at the local market and partly at the needs of the top 10% of the population. By imposing tariffs and quotas, the state has played a key role in protecting this industrialization from the foreign imports for which it is substituting. This type of development, then, has often gone hand in hand with a massive upsurge in long established local film industries, regardless of whether these are owned by private capital or controlled through state film development corporations. A second type of industrialization, characteristic of the quote newly industrializing countries in quote of Southeast Asia, including the Republic of South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, has been built by using cheap local labor for a limited range of products such as textiles and manufactured goods based on labor intensive assembly. The bulk of this output has been export oriented, domestic working class purchasing power being limited by low wages and hence dependent on dislodging declining Western industries in a chosen area of production. Though generally lacking in a strong filmmaking tradition, these countries, too, developed mushrooming film industries in the 1960s and 1970s, usually related to the entertainment needs of the newly created urban proletariat. While in most cases the aim is self sufficiency in the provision of films, Hong Kong has built a flourishing export industry, supplying films to Chinese communities throughout the world and even, for a brief time in the 1970s, breaking into Western domestic markets. The third type of industrialization, that by multinational corporations which merely transfer to a new and cheaper workforce the assembly and, in rare cases, the complete manufacture of goods designed for the world market, is only questionably, quote, third world industrialization, end quote. Capital, technology, and profits are all foreign controlled, and the factory development has little impact outside the narrow enclave controlled by the multinational corporation. It is perhaps a reflection on the lack of connection between this type of industrialization and its quote host end quote country that Singapore, where national control accounts to 70% or more of the economy, is the sole Southeast Asian state lacking in indigenous film industry. The euphoria of revolution. This steady development of industrialization, combined with growing national awareness in the Third World during the 1960s, led almost imperceptibly to a belief which came to be widely held that an era of socialist revolution was dawning throughout the Third World. The omens seemed good. The 1960s began with the completion of decolonization in Africa, apart from the Portuguese territories and the white strongholds in Rhodesia, South Africa, and Southwest Africa. The Cubans were successful in resisting the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The Algerians finally achieved independence in 1962 after 8 years of armed struggle, and the Vietnamese struggled successfully against seemingly impossible odds and overwhelming U.S. military power. As a result, there emerged what Gerard Chaliand has called, quote, a sort of third world euphoria, end quote. As Chaliand shows, there were many factors involved in this 1960s mood: the anti colonial struggle, opposition to the Vietnam War, student revolt, a new consciousness on the part of American blacks, the emergence of armed guerrilla groups in Latin America, developments within the communist world composing China or opposing China to USSR in terms of revolutionary strategy. From the combination of these factors arose, quote, the myth of a tricontinental revolution via the figures of Fanon, Che Guevara, and Ho Chi Minh, end quote, which certainly colored the work of many of the filmmakers who began in the 1960s. They shared the radical mood and felt the need to take an equally heroic stance in their own work. In retrospect, of course, much of what passed for political analysis in the 1960s can now be seen to be false. In North Africa, the FLN, National Liberation Front, as a guerrilla force, had been virtually annihilated by the French military by the time that Algerian independence was fully achieved in 1962. And in Latin America, armed struggle in the name of revolution proved far more difficult than had been anticipated. The Cuban and Vietnamese successes were not to be repeated. Che Guevara's failure to spread revolution outside Cuba and his execution in the Bolivian mountains in 1967 certainly indicate that the spread of revolution cannot be achieved by guerrillas who overestimate their own strength and misjudge the situations they wish to transform. Indeed, the 1960s saw not socialist revolution in Latin America, but the 1964 coup and 1968, quote, coup within the coup, end quote, in Brazil, which heralded a succession of ever more brutal right-wing military coups in the 1970s, most of them with covert U.S. backing. The overthrow and death of the first democratically elected Marxist head of state, Salvador Allende, in Chile in 1973 marks at least the provisional end of an era of hope. The euphoric mood of the late 1960s is very apparent in the work of many of the filmmakers who, born mostly in the 1930s, began as feature film makers at this time. Yılmaz Güney, 1937 through 1984 in Turkey, Glober Rocha, 1938 through 1981 in Brazil, Jorge Sanjanés, born 1936 in Bolivia, Ousmane Sembini, born 1923 in Senegal, Miguel Litton, born 1942 in Chile, Fernando Solanas, born 1936, and Octavio Gatino, born 1935 in Argentina. This was the generation that created so many of the, quote, new cinemas, end quote, of the 1960s and 1970s. Among them, Cinema Novo in Brazil, the Nueva Ola in Argentina, or Nueva Ola in Argentina, and the Cinema of Popular Unity in Chile. These descriptions were often no more than journalistic labels, which many of the filmmakers grouped under them would reject. But they do indicate how these filmmakers, unlike their elders of the 1950s generation, could be seen as participating in a collective movement of revolutionary change that had both national and international dimensions. Belief in the political function of cinema was fundamental to all these filmmakers. Typical subjects adopted were the workings of justice, Litton's The Jackal of Nahulutaro, El Chacal de Nahutaro, 1969, The Corruption of the Newly Emerged Black Elites, Simbini Zala, 1974, and Rural Underdevelopment, Rocha's Antonio das Mortes, 1969. The struggle for national liberation was chronicled in Black Africa by Simbini, in Algeria by Mohamed Lakhdar Hamina, born 1934, and in Tunisia by Omar Cliffy, born 1934, as the treatment of the subject by the Cubans Humberto Solis, born 1942, and Manuel Octavio Gomez, born 1934, showed this 1960s generation was not content to keep to a surface realism. The Mauritanian Med Hondo, born 1936, and Soleil O, or where was I? In Soleil O, Made in Exile in France, offered an allegory of emerging national consciousness, and a similar tendency toward generalizing abstraction could be found in Saint-Genet's indictments of U.S. imperialism. In a study of the internal divisions of a colonized Egypt in Sadi Abdes Salam, born 1930, and in Guinea's epic script of the Clash of Cultures, The Herd, Suru, 1978. For many of these filmmakers, the protective distancing of their work through fiction and imaginary settings was necessary for survival. And it was virtually only in Cuba that documentary could play out its full potential role in the shaping of society. The impact of the Cuban documentarist Santiago Alvarez, born 1919, like that of Beery, was enormous on the various short lived and generally clandestine documentary movements that sprang up from time to time in the 1960s and 1970s in Latin America. Except during brief spells of liberation, critical attitudes are tolerated scarcely anywhere in the Third World. Cuba is unique in the extent to which its filmmakers control their industry, and it is so it is no coincidence that it is there alone that a socially critical form of cinema has been encouraged. But even for filmmakers working within the state-run film industry in a socialist country like like Cuba publicly proclaims its desire to change the lives of its people, tensions and difficulties arise when delicate political issues are tackled. For example, Garcia Espinosa's feature Son O Non Son, shot in 1978 through 79, was never released, though it is listed in the annual production records. Elsewhere in the Third World, though, the situation is very different, and advocacy of change is seen simply as hostility toward the state. In the early 1970s, the cost of advocating change proved to be very high for Third World filmmakers who suffered censorship, imprisonment, exile, and enforced silence. As a result, the satisfyingly rounded careers achieved by the 1950s generation were no longer possible. At its most extreme, there was no career at all in the case of Abdes Salam, who was not able to make a second feature to follow his striking debut with The Night of Counting the Years, Al Momia, 1969. Abdes Salam was at least able to remain in Egypt, where he could complete a number of documentaries. But elsewhere, filmmakers were not so fortunate. The emergence of Cinema Novo in Brazil was followed almost immediately in 1964 by a military coup and a steadily worsening political climate, which by 1968 had driven Rocha and the Mozambican born director of The Guns, Os Fuzis, 1964, Rui Guerrera, born 1931, into temporary exile. The same story was to be repeated throughout Latin America. Bolivia in 1971, keeping Sanginés in exile, Chile after the death of President Allende in 1973, resulting in the departure of Raul Ruiz, born 1941, to France, and of Lytton to Mexico, Argentina in 1976, exiling Solanas and Catino. Similarly, the periodic military interventions in Turkey imprinted themselves on Gunay's life with three successive spells of imprisonment, followed by escape and eventual death in exile. The Mauritanian Med Hondo has made all his films in exile in Paris, and even Sembini, despite his reputation as Black Africa's leading filmmaker, has had a continual battle with the censors in his native Senegal, where Zala was released only after 11 separate cuts and where Cito remained banned for 8 years. But this listing of major figures gives only a partial picture for the various 1970s coups in Latin America led to the exile of virtually everyone, great or small, connected with the film industry. While this had beneficial effects on countries such as Peru and Venezuela, who received the exiles, its effect on the work of the filmmakers was disastrous. The pressures on this generation have been immense, but its members have persisted with incredible vigor. Their efforts, symbolized by Gunay, who scripted the internationally acclaimed The Herd and Yole 1982 in a prison cell, these men were often the founders of their national cinemas, and in some cases, as with Sembini and Sanginese, they worked personally to extend the range and function of cinema by taking their films to remote communities. The profound link that binds each of them to his native country, even when in exile, is very strong and is typified by the treatment of language in their films. Thus, Ousmane Sembini began using Wolof in The Money Order, Mendabi, 1968, before there was an agreed upon written form of the language. While all Jorge San Sanginas while all Jorge Sanginas' films have been made not in the Spanish of the educated elite, but in the languages of the Quechua and Amayara Indians who make up the bulk of Bolivia's population. Their inability to continue to reach the national audience with which they had achieved unique links is thus doubly crippling. Into the 1980s. The period since the mid 1970s is perhaps best understood as a reaction to the exaggerated hopes prevalent in the third world of the late 1960s. There have continued to be occasional examples of genuine political progress, such as the ending of Portuguese rule in Africa, the independence of Zimbabwe under Black majority rule, and the success of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. But the main beneficiaries of the major economic shift of the 1970s, brought about by the enormous rise in oil prices, were among the most reactionary of third world governments. First the Shah and then the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, together with the various kings and princes of the Gulf state. The instances of rapid industrialization that have occurred, as in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Brazil, and Iran, have been both fragile and tightly controlled by multinational corporations. While Western advocates of capitalism have pointed to the considerable developments in Asia and Latin America, events in the 1980s, particularly the world banking crisis, have shown that the balance sheet is not wholly positive. Third world industrialization, built largely on foreign loans and directed at export markets, is very precarious and liable to be brought to a halt by the shifts in the world demand or in world demand. In almost all cases, industrialization has been fostered by an authoritarian regime, a one-party state, or a military government that is prepared to use force to keep the working class in check. Fundamentals of Western democracy, press freedom, trade unionism, freedom of speech and political assembly are systematically denied. Always, the state plays a key role to the benefit of the elite that controls it in cementing alliances with foreign capital, channeling foreign aid, shaping local investment, and protecting profits. Very little of the gross domestic product so generated finds its way to the mass of the people. Moreover, in virtually no case has industrialization actually lessened foreign dependence. These, quote, developing, end quote, countries continue to rely ever more heavily on and Japan and the West for technology, capital, and markets, and in most cases, the industrial development remains an enclave in a largely untransformed agricultural economy. Local cultural production points to the enormous human cost of this development, with the forms and structures of the violent but introspect cinemas of Southwest Asia offering eloquent testimonials to the society's lack of human freedom. It is no longer possible to anticipate world revolution triggered off by third world developments, and the 1970s and early 1980s have therefore been largely a period of re-evaluation for the third world and its theorists. Among the issues that have had to be confronted are the tendency of political independence, especially in Africa, to lead directly into new forms of neocolonial dependence. The problem of bureau- bureaucratization in such cases where social change has occurred, the general failure of the tactics of guerrilla warfare, especially in Latin America, and the dubious results of both the national bourgeoisie revolutions typified by Nasser's Egypt and the various forms of self proclaimed African and Islamic socialism. In short, what is involved is a fundamental questioning of virtually all the established assumptions of progress that were current in the years preceding and immediately following Asian and African independence. The one certainty now is that there will be no easy answers to replace the lost certitudes of the 1960s. In light of this, it is hardly surprising that a consistent pattern of commitment is difficult to discern in the work of the younger filmmakers, those born mostly in the 1940s and beginning their careers in the 1970s, who inevitably reflect in their work, though to varying degrees, the prevailing mood. Perhaps the strongest impression left by third world filmmaking in the 1970s and early 1980s is its stylistic diversity spread and geographical spread. Not only are there now film industries in Bangladesh and Thailand, Indonesia and South Korea, and internationally known filmmakers in virtually all countries with an established film industry, there are also talented filmmakers working in just about every part of the world. Even if we ignore both those working within the constraints of mainstream commercial cinema and those engaged on esoteric explorations that have yet to find an audience, we are still left with a great number of filmmakers working individually to express their national social reality. In some cases, this means operating on the fringes of a national film industry. In documentary production, for instance, in others, it implies initiating filmmaking where no prior local tradition of production exists. The new importance accorded to documentary filmmaking shows that the disillusion with the revolutionary fervor of the late 1960s has not led filmmakers to turn their back on reality. Instead, a questioning, probing stance has become common. It is, of course, too soon to offer any definitive evaluation of these younger filmmakers, most of whom have been unable to make more than a feature film or two. But a brief survey will give some idea of the current diversity of third world film production. 1971 saw the showing of The Cruel Sea by Shabar, the first of two features by the Indian trained Khalid Siddiq from Kuwait. In 1972, the first of a number of deeply researched documentary studies of the poor and the peasantry was made in Colombia in close collaboration with their subjects by Marta Rodriguez and Jorge Silva. In Morocco, Suhail bin Barka made a fictional study of the commercial exploitation of local craft skills. A Thousand and One Hands, Mille et un Mains, 1972, and in Mexico, Paul Leduc began his career as a documentarist with a study of his country's past. Read Insurgent, Read Insurgent Mexico, Read Mexico Insurgent, 1973. A variety of first features appeared in 1974, all with a strong documentary flavor. Harvest 3,000 Years, Mert Sost Shi Amit by the Ethiopian born Haile Gerima, Daily Life in a Syrian Village, Al Hayat Al Yamiya Fi Korea Syria by Umar Amirale Kafir Qasim, an account of an Israeli massacre by the Lebanese Burhan Aliwiya, and One Way or Another, De Certa Manera, the only feature film of the Cuban woman director Sarah Gomez. 1975 was marked by the first part of the masterly documentary trilogy by Patricio Guzman, The Battle of Chile, La Batalla de Chile, and by the appearance of two very talented filmmakers from Black Africa, the politically committed Soleiman Sis, whose first feature was The Girl, Then Muso, and Safi Faye, whose concerned and questioning study of her native village, Letter from My Village, Kada Bekak, showed her training as an ethnographer. 1977 brought a similar diversity with a striking study of the impact of tourism on Tunisia, Son of the Hyenas, Shams al-Diba by Ridha Behi, The Portrait of a Woman Active in a Macho-Dominated Society, Portrait of Teresa, Retrato de Teresa by the Cuban pastor Vega, and a fresh and uninhibited look at Algerian youth, Omar Gatalato by Merzak Olach. In the 1980s, a new personal tone was given to Hong Kong production by Father and Son, Fuzi Qing, 1981, directed by Alan Fong. Also, a diverse array of talent emerged in parts of the world with little or no history of production. Outstanding here are Michelle Khalifi, a Palestinian who gives voice to the Arab minority in Israel, the Syrian Mohammed Malas, who began with a fictional study of Damascus City Dreams, Alam al-Madina, 1985, and three directors of enormous potential from Black Africa, Fadika Kramo Lansine from the Ivory Coast, Gaston Kabore from Burkina Faso, and Rui Duarte from Angola. It is impossible to sum up this surge of emerging talent in a few lines, but the importance of the work produced is more than a sum of individual achievements. Taken together, these filmmakers offer a genuine set of alternatives to North American and European styles. In this way, cinema can cease to be a one-way communication system, imposing stereotypes, quote, made in Hollywood, end quote, indiscriminately on audiences throughout the world. The possibility of a real dialogue between East and West comes nearer. Theory and politics. While earlier developments in third world cinema had been untheorized, the 1960s generation of politically committed filmmakers brought a new, explicitly theoretical approach exemplified by two statements published in 1969, quote, for an imperfect cinema, end quote, by the Cuban Julio Garcia Espinosa, and, quote, towards a third cinema, end quote, by the Argentines Fernando Solanas and Octavio Catino. Garcia Espinosa, writing as a Marxist 10 years after the Cuban Revolution, is concerned with the role of cinema in consolidating an already achieved social transformation and with building a new relationship between culture and society. His starting point is his opposition to the technical perfection of Western cinema, which, quote, is almost always reactionary cinema, end quote, and as such represents the greatest temptation facing Cuban cinema. From Garcia Espinosa's viewpoint, which tallies closely with that of such theorists and national liberation as Cabral and Fanon, the true aim should not be to create a new privileged elite minority of artistic filmmakers, but to question radically the separation between such filmmakers and the mass of the people who have access to neither the training nor the facilities required in filmmaking. Garcia Espinosa attacks the terms in which arguments about the need for commitment in art are conducted. Though the context of his thinking are a post revolutionary society, he rejects the simplistic call for a committed art, asserting that art has its own particular cognitive power. Quote, every artist's desire to express the inexpressible is nothing more than the desire to express the vision of a theme in terms that are inexpressible through other than artistic means, end quote. From this recognition follows an important distinction between art and science. Quote, art can stimulate, in general, the creative function of man. It can function as constant stimulus toward adopting an attitude of change with regard to life. But, as opposed to science, it enriches us in such a way that its results are not specific and cannot be applied to anything in particular, end quote. But the definition of art as, quote, impartial, end quote, or, quote, uncommitted, end quote, that follows from this distinction is meaningless. Garcia Espinosa argues, unless the elite isolation of the artist is destroyed, the real task in hand is, quote, to find out if the conditions which will enable spectators to transform themselves into agents, not merely active spectators, but genuine co-authors, are beginning to exist, end quote. What Garcia Espinosa calls, quote, an authentically revolutionary artistic culture, end quote, cannot draw on mass art, that is, the kind of art made by a minority for the masses, who are defined as mere consumers or spectators, procedures characteristic of Western, quote, perfect, end quote, cinema. But it can draw lessons both from popular art, in which, quote, the creators are at the same time the spectators and vice versa, end quote. And art is, quote, carried out as but another life activity, end quote. And from the struggles within modern art to democratize art, quote, combating the limitations of taste, museum art, and the demarcation lines between the creator and the public, end quote. Film presents inherent difficulties, the impossibility in the short run of turning the masses into filmmakers. But the revolution, defined by Garcia Espinosa as, quote, the highest expression of culture, end quote, does offer the context for a new transitional poetics of cinema. And, quote, imperfect, end quote, cinema, which, quote, finds its audience in those who struggle, end quote, and its themes, quote, its themes in their problems, end quote. For imperfect cinema, the central characters are, quote, lucid, end quote, people. That is, quote, the ones who think and feel and exist in a world which they can change, in spite of all the problems and difficulties. They are convinced that they can transform it in a revolutionary way, end quote. In contrast to Western cinema, which concerns itself with the celebration of results and outcomes, imperfect cinema must, quote, above all, show the process which generates the problems, end quote. To show the process of a problem is not the same as analyzing it. Block quote. To analyze, in the traditional sense of the word, always implies a closed prior judgment. To analyze a problem is to show the problem, not the process, permeated with judgments which the analysis itself generates a priori. To analyze is to block off from the outset any possibility for analysis on the part of the interlocutor. To show the process of a problem, on the one hand, is to submit it to judgment without pronouncing the verdict. To show the process of a problem, on the other hand, is to submit it to judgment without pronouncing the verdict. End of block quote. In its concern with process, imperfect cinema is indifferent to mere quality or technique. Quote, it can be created equally well with a Mitchell or with an 8mm camera in a studio or in a guerrilla camp in the middle of the jungle, end quote. And the test of a filmmaker is quite simply his response to the question, quote, what are you doing in order to overcome the barrier of the, quote, cultured, end quote, elite audience, which up to now has conditioned the form of your work, question mark, end quote. Solanas and Gattino, in their manifesto, quote, towards a third cinema, end quote, echo Garcia Espinosa's distrust of Western formal perfection. Quote, the model of the perfect work of art, the fully rounded film structured according to the metrics imposed by bourgeois culture, its theoreticians and critics, has served to inhibit the filmmaker in the dependent countries, especially when he has attempted to erect similar models in a reality which offered neither the culture, the techniques, nor the most primary elements for success, end quote. But their own position is very different. It is one of filmmakers working clandestinely for social and political change in a hostile environment. Their views are optimistic, however, for they see as the context for the new form of cinema they advocate, quote, the development of a worldwide liberation movement whose moving force is to be found in the third world countries, end quote. Their program, which forms part of a necessary decolonization of culture, proposes a cinema of subversion aimed at, quote, the new man exemplified by Che, end quote. For these reasons, their terminology is full of the imagery of guerrilla combat. A film is, quote, a detonator, end quote, a camera, quote, a rifle, end quote, and a projector, quote, a gun that can shoot 24 frames per second, end quote, while the filmmaker is likened to the guerrilla fighter who, quote, travels along paths that he himself opens up with machete blows, end quote. For Solanas and Gattino, the decolonization of cinema involves two complementary procedures: the destruction of the old modes of conceiving cinema and the old image shaped by colonialism and neocolonialism, and the creation of a new cinema, the, quote, construction of a throbbing, living reality which recaptures truth in any of its expressions, end quote. They begin their consideration by challenging two existing forms of cinema, both of which are, quote, perfect, end quote, in Garcia Espinosa's terms. For them, quote, first cinema, end quote, is Hollywood, and they point out the difficulty of locating, even in the socialist world, examples of work totally outside the Hollywood film model. But this model must be attacked on every level. Since language and ideology are inseparable, even the adoption of the merely formal elements of the dominant Hollywood film language leads inevitably to the adoption of the ideological assumptions deriving from U.S. finance capital that underlie them. The only real alternatives to Hollywood cinema that they pick out are those forms of, quote, authors cinema, end quote, from the French Nouvelle Vague to the Brazilian Cinema Novo, which they dub, quote, second cinema, end quote. For Solanas and Gattino, however, even the advance that these represent is not, or is a limited one. Although they do constitute attempts at cultural decolonization and lead their filmmakers to express themselves, quote, in non-standard language, end quote, they are still contained within the dominant system. Only, quote, third cinema, end quote, which they advocate, breaks free of these constraints. Solanas and Gattino then see the main basis of revolutionary cinema as the documentary, quote, every image that documents, bears witness to, refutes, or deepens the truth of a situation is something more than a film image or purely artistic fact. It becomes something which the system finds indigestible, end quote. But documentary can only have this impact if it no longer echoes the stance common in the West. Revolutionary cinema, quote, is not fundamentally one which illustrates, documents, or passively establishes a situation. Rather, it attempts to intervene in the situation as an element providing thrust or rectification, end quote. Thus, it is less a cinema denouncing the effects of neocolonialism than one that examines causes, quote, to investigate the ways of organizing and arming for the change, end quote. Solanas and Gattino's own stance is based on their confidence in the mass audience. For the effectiveness of the best militant cinema, they claim, has shown that, quote, social layers considered backward, end quote, are able, quote, to capture the exact meaning of an association of images, an effect of staging, and any linguistic experimentation placed within the context of a given idea, end quote. Filmmakers are therefore free to be innovative in their use of the resources of cinema, but for revolutionary communication to occur, filmmakers must discard any preconceptions about their, quote, rights, end quote, as artists. They must also disregard the traditional film industry's notions of hierarchy and professionalism and work instead to demystify the medium. Third cinema can only fulfill its role as, quote, the most important revolutionary artistic event of our times, end quote, when filmmakers oppose the cinema of characters, individuals, and authors with a cinema of themes, the masses, and collective work, and when they replace misinformation, escape, and passivity with information, truth, and action. In short, when they build not, quote, a cinema made for the old kind of human being, end quote, but, quote, a cinema fit for a new kind of human being, for what each of us has the possibility of becoming, end quote. Neither of these manifestos offers a narrowly prescriptive view of cinema committed to revolutionary change. Solanas and Gattino's guerrilla cinema may be defined in terms of documentary, but it embraces a whole host of forms: film letter, film poem, film essay, film pamphlet, and film report. And the richness of their approach is born out of their own masterly documentary, The Hour of the Furnaces, La Hora de los Hornos, 1968. Similarly, Garcia Espinosa's approach implies a breakdown of the rigid categories of documentary and fiction, and this has become a characteristic feature of Cuban cinema since the late 1960s. The relationship between culture and society that these manifestos posit draws its lessons from the liberation struggle and from the writings of such theorists as Cabral and Fanon. To some extent, the optimism of the late 1960s has proved to be ill-founded, having underestimated, in particular, the extremes to which the United States is willing to go to protect its, quote, interest, end quote. But the rethinking of cinema undertaken by Latin American theorists will continue to have relevance as long as film is given the function of contributing to social and political change. And I was reading Chapter 6, Third Cinema in Third World Filmmaking and the West, 1987, by Roy Ames.